council chamber, wearing his ceremonial armor, and watching the great doors at the far end of the hall, and he waited for the humans to arrive. The council expected conquerors. They expected armored soldiers and warships in orbit, and the heavy boots of an occupying force, because that was what the Dominion would have sent if the positions were reversed. That was what any species would send. You won the war, and you came to claim the spoils. The doors opened, and the human delegation walked in, and the council chamber went quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with confusion. General Marcus Cole led the group. He wore a simple dark uniform, with no medals and no insignia of rank, and he walked with the unhurried pace of a man who had nothing to prove. Behind him came not soldiers, but doctors and engineers and scientists, carrying cases of medical supplies and agricultural data and technical blueprints. They had brought aid, not for themselves, but for the Dominion worlds that had been damaged in the fighting. Worlds that in many cases the humans themselves had damaged. They brought medicine for species whose biology they had only recently learned to understand. They brought food production techniques adapted for alien ecosystems. They brought engineering teams ready to help rebuild infrastructure that their own weapons had destroyed. The council stared and did not understand. In a private briefing room adjacent to the chamber, Intelligence Director Sovan stood before the remaining members of High Command and delivered her final assessment of the human species, the last report she would write before her resignation. "I know you are confused," she said. "I know that what you are seeing does not match what you expected, and I know that this confusion is making some of you feel relieved, as if perhaps the humans are not as dangerous as we feared, as if perhaps the war revealed the worst of them, and now we are seeing the best." She paused, and her 4 eyes swept the room. "You are wrong. What you are seeing is what makes them the most dangerous species this galaxy has ever encountered. They can turn it on and turn it off. They will fight you with the savagery of beasts, and then they will sit across from you and offer you food. They will burn your fleet and then send doctors to heal your wounded. This is not contradiction. This is what they are. They contain both things at once, and they choose which one to show you, based on what you deserve." She let that settle. They do not conquer, they absorb. They will make allies of their enemies, and their enemies will be grateful for it. They will offer you partnership and aid and friendship, and it will be genuine, because humans are capable of genuine kindness. But it will also serve their interests, because humans are capable of thinking 10 moves ahead while smiling at you. This is how they consumed their own world, not through empires that ruled by force, but through cultures that spread by attraction. They did not defeat us with warships. They defeated us with the fact that 14 species looked at them and decided they would rather be on their side than ours. She turned off her display. They are not monsters. That is what makes them terrifying. A monster you can kill. What do you do with a species that destroys your fleet on Monday and brings you medicine on Tuesday, and means it both times? She walked out of the briefing room, and she did not look back. The peace treaty was negotiated over 3 days, and it granted humanity full membership in the Galactic Dominion, with all the rights and privileges that entailed. But everyone in the room knew that the word membership was a polite fiction. The power dynamic had shifted, and it would never shift back. Humanity was not joining the Dominion. They were reshaping it from the inside, and they were doing it with handshakes and humanitarian aid, and that terrible duality that Sovan had described. On the final evening of the summit, there was a reception in the Great Hall. Species from across the galaxy mingled and drank and made careful conversation and tried to pretend that the world had not changed, even though it had. Vasquez was there in a dress uniform that she clearly found uncomfortable, her cybernetic arm polished to a dark shine. She stood near a window with a glass of something that a Tessari server had assured her was safe for human consumption. And she watched the stars outside, and she was thinking about the soldiers she had lost on Titan and at Proxima, and all the places in between. She became aware of someone standing beside her, and she turned and found herself looking up at Vorath Kale. He was enormous, nearly 8 feet of insectoid exoskeleton and compound eyes, the greatest military mind of 3 centuries, the commander who had tried to wipe her species from existence. He stood there holding a glass of his own in one of his 4 hands, and he regarded her with an expression she could not read. "Major Vasquez," he said. "Supreme Commander," she replied. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Vorath spoke. "I have thought about your species every day since Titan. I have studied your history, and your wars, and your art, and your music, and I understand you less now than I did when we first discovered your world. You are a contradiction that should not function, and yet you do." Vasquez took a sip of her drink, and said nothing. "I have one question," Vorath said, "and I have traveled across the galaxy to ask it, because it is the only question that matters." "Ask it," Vasquez said. "How do your people fight like that? What drives you? Your bodies are fragile, your technology was inferior, you were outnumbered 1,000 to 1, by every rational measure you should have surrendered or been destroyed. What is the force that kept you fighting when there was no logical reason to continue?" Vasquez looked up at him, and she considered the question. And she thought about all the ways she could answer it. She could talk about duty or honor or love of home, or the survival instinct, or the bonds between soldiers, or the deep human refusal to accept the unacceptable. But she was a simple woman, and she believed in simple answers. She took another sip of her drink and shrugged. "We just really hate losing," she said. Vorath Kale stared at her, and his mandibles moved slightly in what might have been an attempt to formulate a response, but nothing came. The greatest strategic mind in 3 centuries had no answer for that, not because it was profound, but because it was so simple and so human that no amount of analysis could break it down into something he could understand. Vasquez smiled at him, not the fierce smile of the soldier on Titan, but a different kind, warm and tired and real, and she raised her glass, and Vorath, after a moment, raised his own, and they drank together in silence, while the stars turned slowly outside. Window. Far away on a world called Earth, in a city called Geneva, a Tassari named Lysae walked through a park on a warm afternoon, and she watched the human children playing. They were playing a game with a ball and 2 goals, and teams that seemed to shift and change by rules she could not determine. It was loud and chaotic, and the children threw themselves into it, with a ferocity that would have been alarming if it were not so clearly joyful. They screamed and shoved and dove into the dirt, and argued about rules, and then immediately forgot the argument and kept playing. One small girl fell hard on the grass and skinned her knee, and Lysae watched her, expecting the child to cry or stop or call for help. Instead, the girl looked down at the blood on her knee and made a face that was more annoyed than pained, and she got back up without pausing and ran back into the game as if nothing had happened. Lysae watched for a long time, and she felt the Vethnal again, that cold, Tesseri awareness of something she could not understand, but it was softer now, mixed with something else, something that might have been admiration. She returned to her quarters that evening, and opened her terminal, and accessed the Dominion Species Classification Database. She found the entry for humanity, which still read Class 2 Primitive, because nobody had updated it since the war began, and she deleted it. She stared at the empty field for a moment, and then she began to type. Species, human. Homeworld, Earth. Sol 3. Classification, Class Omega. And beside the classification, she added a note. 2 words that would remain in the database long after she was gone. 2 words that would be read by Dominion commanders and diplomats and scientists for centuries to come. 2 words that said everything that needed to be said about the small, fierce species from the blue world on the edge of the galaxy. "Do not engage." She saved the file and closed her terminal, sat in the quiet of her room. And outside the window, the sun was setting over the human city, and the children were still playing, and their laughter carried through the warm air like something ancient and unstoppable and alive. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had not slept in 4 days, and she stood in the hangar bay of the secret lunar facility, staring at the 12 ships that represented the last best hope of the human species. And she thought they looked terrible. They were ugly things, human warships that had been gutted and rebuilt around captured Dominion faster-than-light drives that her team had reverse-engineered in 11 weeks, a process that had taken the Tasari 400 years when they first developed the technology. But the Tasari had been careful and methodical and thorough, and Tanaka's team had been desperate. The drives worked, she was almost certain of that. The navigation was approximate, which meant each ship would arrive somewhere in the general vicinity of its target coordinates. The power systems were held together with emergency welds and prayers, and there was roughly a 30% chance that any given ship would simply tear itself apart when the drive activated. Explained all of this to General Cole in a briefing that morning, and he had listened with the patient expression of a man who had already accepted every possible outcome, and he had asked only one question. Will volunteers be a problem? Tanaka had almost laughed, because when the call went out for crews willing to fly experimental ships with a 1 in 3 chance of instant death on a mission deep into enemy territory, with no possibility of retreat or rescue, the number of volunteers exceeded the available positions by a factor of 40. They had to turn people away. Cole named the Operation Prometheus after an old story about stealing fire from the gods, and he briefed the crews himself in a cargo bay on the lunar base, standing on a metal crate so everyone could see him, a 61-year-old man with gray hair and calm eyes who read a poem before every battle, because he believed that a species worth saving should remember what made it worth saving. "Know what is coming," he said. "They are building a fleet to wipe us out, not conquer us, not subjugate us, erase us. Every human being, every record of our existence, every song, and every story, and every child who will never be born. That is what they intend." He paused and looked across the faces before him. Operation Prometheus is simple. 12 ships jump to their staging ground at Proxima Centauri. We arrive before their armada is fully assembled, and we hit them so hard that they never recover. We carry nuclear warheads and boarding teams because we are going to do something that no species in this galaxy has done for thousands of years. We are going to board their ships and take them. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Cole let it settle. "I will not promise you survival. I will not promise you victory. I will promise you this. They will remember what happened at Proxima for as long as their civilization exists. You are the fire, and you are going to burn them. Make it count." The 12 ships launched from the dark side of the moon and accelerated to the edge of the solar system, where the captured FTL drives could be safely activated, and one by one, they jumped. 3 of them never arrived. The FTL drives on those 3 ships failed in transit, and the vessels were torn apart in the space between stars. Their crews had known this was possible. They had volunteered anyway. 9 ships emerged from faster-than-light travel in the Proxima Centauri system, and they arrived in the middle of the Dominion staging ground like wolves appearing inside a sheep pen. The cleansing armada was still assembling, thousands of warships in various stages of preparation, supply vessels and troop transports, and the massive dreadnoughts that formed the backbone of the fleet. They were arranged in neat formation grids because the Dominion had never been attacked at a staging ground in its entire history, and the concept of a defensive formation in their own territory was as foreign as the concept of a fish drowning. The 9 human ships materialized so close to the Dominion formation that their arrival signatures blinded nearby sensors. They were inside the Dominion's weapon engagement range, which meant the enemy's long-range plasma batteries and missile systems were useless, because firing them would hit their own ships. It was a knife fight in a room full of furniture, and humans have been fighting with knives since before they could write. The nuclear warheads launched first, small fast payloads aimed at the largest dreadnoughts. The explosions bloomed in silence in the vacuum of space, white flowers of destruction that gutted 3 capital ships in the first 30 seconds, and sent shockwaves of debris tearing through the tightly packed formation. Then the boarding parties launched. Breaching pods fired from the human ships and slammed into Dominion hulls, cutting through armor with shaped charges and disgorging teams of human soldiers into the corridors of alien warships. This was the part that broke the Dominion's understanding of war. Boarding actions had been abandoned by galactic civilization over 4,000 years ago. They were considered barbaric and inefficient, a relic of a primitive age. No modern warship was designed to repel boarders, because no modern species would attempt something so savage. The Dominion crews had no training for close-quarters combat. Their internal security was designed to handle minor disturbances, not armed assault teams. The corridors of their ships were wide and well-lit, with smooth walls and open intersections, because they had been designed for comfort and efficiency, not defense. The humans turned those corridors into killing fields. They moved in small teams, fast and coordinated, using the same close combat tactics that their species had developed over centuries of fighting in buildings and tunnels. Trenches on their home world, they used the corners and the doorways and the furniture as cover. They threw grenades around bends and charged through smoke, and they fought with a ferocity that the Dominion crews could not comprehend. Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez led a boarding team onto the Eternal Verdict itself. She had been promoted after Titan, and she had a new cybernetic arm to replace the one she lost in the fighting there. A matte black prosthetic that was stronger than the original, and she had asked the engineers to make it that way on purpose. Her team of 40 soldiers cut through the flagship's security like a blade through cloth, deck by deck, corridor by corridor, fighting their way upward toward the command bridge. They lost soldiers along the way, because the Keth guards were not helpless, even if they were unprepared, and the fighting was brutal and close and loud. Vasquez took a plasma burn across her ribs on deck 7, and she kept moving. Fragment of shrapnel in her thigh on deck 12, and she kept moving. A Queth guard twice her size grabbed her in a corridor on deck 15, and she drove her cybernetic fist through his chest plate, and she kept moving. She reached the command bridge with 11 soldiers remaining out of 40, and they breached the door with explosive charges and poured through the smoke into the wide circular room where Vorath Kale had stood so many times in absolute confidence. The bridge crew surrendered, some of them. Others fought and died. Vorath Kale was not there, because he had been evacuated to an escape pod minutes before. But the flagship was taken. Around the staging ground, the battle raged for 6 hours. And when it was over, the Cleansing Armada's flagship was destroyed. 40% of the assembled fleet was crippled or captured, and the remaining ships had scattered into deep space in a retreat so chaotic that it would take weeks to reassemble them. Had done this. 9 ships with jury-rigged engines and experimental drives, and crews who had known they would probably die and had come anyway. Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Eternal Verdict, and she was covered in blood. Some of it hers, but most of it not. Her uniform was torn and burned, her cybernetic arm was dented and scarred, and she was breathing hard, and her hands were shaking, but her eyes were steady. One of her soldiers found the communication console and got it working, and Vasquez walked over to it and opened a channel, not a targeted transmission, but a broad-spectrum broadcast on every Dominion frequency they could reach. She stood there for a moment, looking at the console, and then she leaned forward and spoke 2 words in a voice that was quiet and raw, and carried no emotion except absolute certainty. "We are coming." The transmission traveled outward at the speed of light, and it was picked up by relay stations and rebroadcast across the Dominion network and within hours it had reached 1,000 worlds. On those worlds, commanders and politicians and citizens heard the voice of a human woman standing on the captured bridge of what had been the most powerful warship in the galaxy. And they heard those two words. And they understood something that Vorath Kale had understood on Titan, when he watched the footage of the smiling soldier. They understood that they had made a terrible mistake. And somewhere in the escape pod, drifting through the debris field of his shattered fleet, Vorath Kale sat in the dark and listened to the transmission. And he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The fourth subjugation fleet arrived in the Sol system like a storm rolling over flat land. 800 warships emerging from faster-than-light travel in a wave of blue-white light that lit up the darkness around Saturn and its moons. Hive Captain Dren stood aboard his landing carrier and watched the human orbital defenses crumble on his tactical display. The small stations and weapons platforms that humanity had placed around Saturn lasted less than 20 minutes against Dominion firepower. They burst apart like glass ornaments struck by stones, and Dren felt the familiar satisfaction of a job proceeding according to plan. He was Kef like Vorath Kale, though smaller and younger, built more for ground combat than for the chess game of fleet command. His exoskeleton was scarred from 14 successful planetary pacifications, and he wore those scars with the quiet pride of a professional. Scans show a human military outpost on the 6th moon, his intelligence reported. Officer reported, designation Titan, approximately 200 enemy combatants, lightly armed, no heavy armor, no air support. Dren considered the numbers. He had 10,000 shock troops under his command, veteran soldiers drawn from 6 different Dominion species, armed with plasma weapons and supported by heavy mechanized walkers that stood 3 stories tall. 10,000 against 200. Begin the landing, he ordered. Formation Kale 7, standard sweep pattern. I want the outpost secured before the next cycle. The dropships descended through Titan's thick orange atmosphere in neat rows, like seeds falling from a tree. They touched down on the frozen surface 2 kilometers from the human outpost, and Dren's troops poured out into the dim alien landscape. Titan was a strange world, covered in lakes of liquid methane, blanketed by a haze so thick the sun was just a faint smudge in the sky. The temperature was cold enough to freeze most organic compounds solid, and the ground crunched beneath Dominion boots like dry sand. The first engagement went exactly as expected. Dren's forward units advanced on the outpost and met scattered resistance, human soldiers firing from behind makeshift barricades with projectile weapons that pinged harmlessly off Dominion energy shields. Within minutes the humans began to fall back, and Dren watched their positions collapse on his tactical map like dominoes. The enemy is retreating in disarray, he reported to the fleet above him. Outpost will be secured within the hour. He was wrong. The humans were not retreating in disarray. They were drawing Dren's forces forward into the killing ground that Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez had spent the last 72 hours preparing, while the politicians back on Earth pretended to deliberate. Vasquez was 42 years old, with short dark hair, and a cybernetic left eye that glowed faint blue in the dim light of Titan. Had served in 3 wars on Earth, before volunteering for the outer system postings, and she had spent her entire adult life studying one subject: how to kill an enemy that outnumbered her. She crouched in a bunker carved into the frozen rock beneath the outpost, and watched the Dominion forces flood into the valley between the methane lakes. And she waited until the bulk of their advance units were exactly where she wanted them. Then she gave the order. The ground erupted. Every step of the retreat had been calculated. Every position the humans abandoned had been rigged. The frozen soil was laced with thousands of improvised explosive devices built from mining charges and fuel cell components. The methane refineries that the Dominion troops were using as cover detonated in columns of blue fire that rose hundreds of meters into the orange sky. The lakes of liquid methane that bordered the valley ignited, and walls of flame cut off the advance forces from their next move. Reserves. In the space of 90 seconds, Dren lost 2,000 troops. The survivors stumbled through smoke and fire, and that was when the humans emerged from their hidden positions, not from the outposts that Dren had been watching, but from tunnels and caves dug into the valley walls, from beneath the frozen ground itself, from places that should not have held living beings. They came in the dark because they had destroyed every light source in the valley, and the smoke blinded Dominion sensors. And they fought at ranges so close that the plasma weapons that gave the Dominion its advantage became a liability, because at close range, a plasma bolt was just as dangerous to the shooter as to the target. Vasquez led a team of 30 soldiers into the left flank of the Dominion formation, and they moved through the chaos like wolves through a herd. The humans used solid projectile weapons that did not rely on energy cells or targeting computers, weapons that worked when they were dirty and broken and frozen, weapons that their species had been perfecting for over 1,000 years. Dren watched his casualty count climb with a feeling he had never experienced in 14 campaigns. It was not fear exactly, but it was something close, something that whispered to him that the rules he understood did not apply here. He sent in his heavy walkers, 3-story mechanized units that could level a building with a single shot. They waded into the valley expecting to turn the tide, and for a few minutes they did. Their heavy plasma cannons cut through the smoke and rock, and the humans fell back again. Then Dren saw something on his combat feed that he would remember for the rest of his life. A human soldier, a young woman, emerged from behind a collapsed structure directly in the path of a heavy walker. She was wounded. He could see that from the way she moved, one arm hanging wrong at her side, and blood on her face, visible even through the makeup. Haze of battle. She was carrying something strapped to her chest, and she was running directly at the walker. The walker's gunner saw her and fired, but the shot went wide in the smoke, and she kept running. She reached the walker and threw herself against its forward leg joint, the weakest point in the design, and she should not have known that. She should not have known anything about Dominion engineering. The explosion tore the walker apart from the inside. What stayed with Dren was not the explosion itself, but the image captured by the walker's external camera in the final frame before destruction. The woman's face, and she was smiling, not a grimace or a snarl, but a genuine smile, as if in that last moment she had found something that pleased her. The battle lasted 14 hours. When it was over, Vasquez held the outpost with 63 surviving soldiers, and the frozen valley was a graveyard of Dominion dead. Dren had lost 6,000 troops to take. A single position on a moon that nobody in the Dominion had heard of a month ago. He pulled his surviving forces back to the landing zone and transmitted his combat report and the footage to High Command aboard the Eternal Verdict. On the bridge, Vorith Kale stood, surrounded by his officers, and watched the footage in silence. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Even the ambient sounds of the bridge seemed to die as they watched the recording play. They watched humans fight with injuries that should have left them immobile. They watched a man with both legs destroyed prop himself against a wall and continue firing his weapon for 40 minutes until he finally bled out. They watched soldiers scream words in human languages that the translators rendered as things like, "Come and get it," and "Is that all you have?" And they watched the young woman smile as she gave her life to destroy a machine that outweighed her by a factor of 10,000. The footage ended, and the bridge remained silent. Lysay stood at her station and quietly opened her threat assessment file. She deleted the rating of 1.7 and stared at the blank field for a long time, her 4 eyes unblinking. Then she typed a single word where the number should have been. Unclassifiable. Vorith Kale stood at the center of his bridge, and for the first time, in a career that spanned decades and dozens of conquered worlds, he did not immediately issue an order. He stared at the frozen final frame of the footage, the face of the smiling woman, and he said nothing. Around him his officers waited, and the silence stretched, and somewhere in that silence something shifted in the war. Not in tactics or strategy, but in something deeper, something that the Dominion had not felt in 12,000 years of unchallenged rule. It was the first cold touch of doubt. And on Titan, far below, Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez sat among her surviving soldiers in the ruins of the outpost. They had held, and she cleaned her weapon and checked her ammunition, and she looked up at the orange sky where she knew the Dominion fleet was orbiting, and she felt nothing that resembled fear. 3 months into the war, the Galactic Dominion controlled the space lanes of the Sol system with 5,000 warships, and they were winning every battle that took place among the stars. Their fleet superiority was absolute. Their technology was centuries ahead, and by every metric that the Dominion used to measure war, they were on the path to victory. But the metrics were wrong. Intelligence Director Sovan sat alone in her office aboard the analysis vessel Quiet Eye and stared at the reports flooding her screens. She felt a sensation that her species, the Tesserae, called Vethnal, which translated roughly as the awareness that you are looking at something you do not understand, and that your inability to understand it may kill you. The ground war was a disaster. Every asteroid outpost that the Dominion occupied became a nightmare within days. Human soldiers who formally surrendered were found with weapons hidden in their clothing a week later. Depots were sabotaged by workers who had passed every security scan. Communication lines were cut by operatives who moved through maintenance tunnels that the Dominion did not even know existed. On Mars, a garrison of 2,000 Dominion troops controlled the capital settlement during the day, and hid inside their fortified compound at night, because the darkness belonged to the humans. On the moon called Europa, a Dominion intelligence officer was found dead at his desk with a human knife in his back, and no record of any unauthorized entry. On Ceres, the entire occupying force simply vanished one night, and was never found. But the worst of it was happening in the asteroid belt, where a human admiral named Li Wei was conducting a campaign that Sovan had come to think of as a masterwork of destruction. Li Wei had 40 ships, 40 against 5,000, and by every rational calculation he should have been dead in the first week. Instead, he had turned the asteroid belt into a hunting ground. He used tactics that no species in the Dominion had seen before, because no species in the Dominion had ever developed them, because no species in the Dominion had ever needed to. He hid his ships among the tumbling rocks and waited in complete silence with all systems powered down, sometimes for days. And when a Dominion patrol passed within range, he struck from ambush and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. He used the asteroids themselves as weapons, nudging them into new orbits with small explosive charges, so that they drifted into shipping lanes and collided with transport vessels. He deployed clouds of tiny drones that attached themselves to Dominion hulls and detonated on command hours or days later, when the ships were docked at stations surrounded by other vessels. In 8 weeks, he destroyed or disabled over 300 Dominion warships, and he lost only 12 of his own. Vorath Kale ordered an entire battle group to hunt Li Wei down, and they chased him through the belt for 2 weeks and found nothing, because Li Wei had studied the history of submarine warfare on Earth, a form of combat where humans had learned to hide in an ocean that covered their world and strike from below. And he applied every lesson from those old wars to the new battlefield of space. Sovan compiled her findings into a psychological profile of the human species, and she requested an emergency audience with high command. She stood before Vorath Kale and the senior officers of the Dominion fleet, and she was afraid, but not of them. She was afraid of what she had learned. "I have completed my analysis of the human species," she began, and her voice was steady because Tesserae were trained to suppress emotional displays. and I must inform the Command Council that our current models for understanding enemy behavior are inadequate for this adversary. She activated her display, and the first data point. Humans produce their own combat stimulants naturally. Their bodies generate a chemical called adrenaline that increases strength, dulls pain, and accelerates reaction time. They do not need injections or implants to enter a heightened combat state. Their own biology does it for them. This means that every human soldier you face is effectively self-medicating for war at all times. She moved to the next point. Their pain response includes a mechanism called shock that allows them to continue functioning even with catastrophic injuries. We have documented cases of human soldiers fighting effectively for extended periods with wounds that would incapacitate any Dominion species instantly. They do not ignore pain. They simply continue despite it. The room was quiet, and Sovan continued. They form social bonds of extraordinary intensity. When a human soldier witnesses the death of a comrade, it does not demoralize them in the way our models predict. Instead, it triggers a response they call rage. They become more aggressive, more reckless, and more dangerous. Killing their companions does not break their will to fight. It amplifies it. She paused and looked at Vorath Kale directly. But the most significant finding is a concept that has no equivalent in any Dominion language. They call it spite. It is the willingness to accept your own destruction, if it means inflicting harm on your enemy. It is not a tactic. It is an emotion, a deeply rooted psychological drive that overrides self-preservation. We saw it on Titan, when the soldier destroyed the walker. We see it every day in the asteroid belt. Humans will spend their own lives like currency if the exchange rate is favorable enough. She brought up her final display. They have been practicing this for 10,000 years, against each other. Every generation of humans has fought wars, studied those wars, learned from those wars, and taught the next generation. To fight better, they are not a species that encountered war. They are a species that was forged by it. War is not something they do, it is something they are. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Sovan had experienced in her career. Vorath Kale stood motionless for a long time, and then he spoke. Convene the Galactic Dominion Council. I am recommending the deployment of the Cleansing Armada. The words hit the room like a physical blow. The Cleansing Armada was the Dominion's weapon of last resort, a fleet so vast and so powerful that it had only been deployed twice in 12,000 years, and both times it had resulted in the complete annihilation of the target species. It was not a tool of conquest, it was a tool of extinction. Envoy Koron, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the room, stepped forward. Supreme Commander, I must object. I have been communicating with human prisoners, and I believe they can be reasoned with. They are not mindless. They are not animals. They have art and music and philosophy. They love their children. They build things of beauty. This is not a species that deserves extinction. Not entirely true. Admiral Li Wei was many things, but above all he was patient and thorough, and during one of his ambushes his boarding teams had captured a Dominion communications relay intact. His engineers had been working on it for weeks, and they had managed to decode fragments of Dominion transmissions. Most of it was routine, but one fragment was not routine at all. It contained 2 words that the translation software rendered as Cleansing Armada. Li Wei did not know exactly what those words meant, but he understood the weight of them from the context and the frequency with which they appeared in high-priority channels. He sat alone in his quarters aboard his battered flagship, and he composed a message to Earth. He encoded it in the old submarine communication protocols that the Dominion had not yet learned to detect, and he sent it into the dark. The message reached General Marcus Cole in his command bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, once, and then read it again, and then he stood up and walked to the window of his office and looked out at the stone walls of the tunnel that surrounded him. They are afraid, Li Wei had written. Good, now we make them right to be. Cole stared at those words for a long time, and then he picked up his communicator and connected to a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who was working in a laboratory on the far side of the moon in a facility so secret that fewer than 50 people on Earth knew it existed. "Doctor," he said, "how soon?" There was a pause, and then Tanaka's voice came through, tired and strained, but carrying an edge of excitement that could not be hidden. 2 weeks, maybe less. It is not going to be pretty, and it is not going to be safe, but it will work. Cole nodded, even though she could not see him. "Make it less," he said, and ended the call. He walked back to his desk and sat down and opened a book of poetry that he kept there, and he read for a while in the quiet of the bunker, while above him the sky was full of enemy ships, and somewhere beyond the stars, an armada of extinction was being built. He was calm, because panic was useless, and fear was a luxury. And there was work to be done. The bridge of the Dominion flagship, Eternal Verdict, was quiet in the way that only a place of absolute power could be quiet. Not from absence of sound, but from the weight of authority that pressed down on every soul who stood there. Supreme Commander Vorath Kale stood at the center of it all, his insectoid frame towering nearly 8 feet tall, his forearms folded behind his back as he gazed at the holographic display rotating slowly before him, a small blue world orbiting a yellow star on the edge of the galaxy's western spiral arm. "What am I looking at?" he asked without turning. Fleet Analyst Lysay stepped forward, her 4 amber eyes blinking rapidly as she pulled up data streams alongside the projection, her small tessari frame barely reaching the commander's chest. "A newly cataloged system, Supreme Commander, designation Sol 3. The dominant species calls their world Earth. They are a Class 2 primitive civilization, spacefaring, but confined entirely to their home system. They have managed to colonize their moon and establish small outposts on a handful of moons and planets nearby, but nothing of real significance. Their weapons technology is roughly 600 years behind ours. Their fastest ships would take decades to reach the nearest star. They have no energy shielding, no faster-than-light capability, and their population is divided into competing nation-states that spend as much time fighting each other as cooperating." Vorath almost turned away then, because a score of 1.7 barely warranted his attention, but something on the display caught his eye, a small counter in the corner of the human data file that tracked a metric the Dominion recorded for all species. "What is that number?" he asked, pointing one long clawed finger, P. Lysay glanced at it, and her 4 eyes blinked again. "That is their conflict index, Supreme Commander. It measures the frequency and intensity of internal wars throughout a species' recorded history." "And why is it red?" Lysay paused, and for the first time in her career, her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Because it is the highest we have ever recorded for any species in the Dominion database. The humans have been engaged in armed conflict with each other for virtually their entire recorded history. Over 15,000 wars in the last 5,000 years alone." Vorath stared at the number for a long moment, and then made another clicking sound, this one dismissive. "Savages fighting savages. That is not strength. That is chaos. Send the envoy. Standard protocol." 3 days later, diplomatic envoy Chorin descended to the surface of Earth in a shuttle that gleamed like liquid silver against the blue sky. Pelhari, a species that had evolved beyond violence so long ago that their bodies had lost the capacity for it. Their bones were light as paper, their skin thin as silk, and their voices carried a harmonic resonance that most species found soothing and trustworthy, which was exactly why the Dominion used them as diplomats. Choron was escorted to a large building that the humans called the United Nations, and there he stood before a room full of human leaders and delivered the same speech he had delivered to 47 other species over his long career. "People of Earth, I bring greetings from the Galactic Dominion, a coalition of over 300 species spanning this galaxy. Your system falls within the boundaries of Dominion expansion territory, and as such, you are formally required to submit to Dominion governance. Your military forces will be disbanded. Your resources will be cataloged and allocated according to Dominion needs. And in exchange, you will receive the protection and technological advancement that comes with membership in the greatest civilization this galaxy has ever known. He paused and waited for the reaction he always received. The stunned silence, the trembling, the desperate pleas for mercy or time. Instead, a woman in the front row leaned forward and said, "How many ships are in your fleet?" Charon blinked his large gentle eyes. "I beg your pardon?" "Your fleet," the woman repeated calmly. "How many combat vessels are currently deployed in this sector?" A man beside her spoke next. "What are your supply line distances from your nearest forward base to our system?" Then another. "What are your rules of engagement regarding civilian populations?" And another. "Do your ground forces operate with air support or independent logistics?" Charon felt something he had not felt in decades, a chill running through his thin bones. These were not the questions of a frightened people. Questions of a people who were already planning. He gathered himself and smiled in the way Pelhari smiled, a gentle curving of his features meant to comfort. "These details are not relevant to your decision. The Dominion's military capability is beyond anything your species can challenge. I assure you of that. I urge you to accept our offer of peaceful integration." The woman in the front row studied him for a moment, and then nodded. "We would like 72 hours to deliberate." Chorin granted it gladly, because no Class II species had ever refused after being given time to consider the reality of their situation. Time was the Dominion's ally, because time allowed fear to do its work. He returned to the Eternal Verdict and reported to Vorath Kale that the humans would submit within 3 days. Vorath nodded and turned his attention to other matters, because Earth was not important enough to occupy more than a fraction of his thoughts. 72 hours passed. The transmission from Earth arrived on the bridge of the Eternal Verdict at exactly the moment the deadline expired, not a second early, not a second late. And it contained a single sentence, broadcast on every frequency the humans could reach. "We decline." Vorath read it once, and made a sound that among the Keth was the equivalent of a tired sigh. "Dispatch the 4th Subjugation Fleet, 800 vessels. Standard pacification protocol. I want this resolved within 1 cycle." The officers on the bridge moved to comply, and the machinery of conquest began to turn with the ease of long practice, because this had happened before. Every few centuries, some young species found its courage, and the Dominion simply crushed that courage until it became obedience. As the fleet orders were transmitted across the network, Lycie sat alone at her analysis station, staring at the Human Conflict Index, that bright red number that pulsed on her screen like a warning light. She had run the numbers again during the 72 hours, and she had found something.